So without further ado, we're going to get started because there is quite a lot of things we've got to go through. So first and foremost, let me introduce myself and also who we are for those of you who do not know. So my name's Steve Smith. I'm the CEO of Combined Knowledge, and we are a company that's been around since 2002 when it was formed. I'm also a Microsoft Regional Director, which basically means that in every country, or most countries, there's a regional director who Microsoft nominates, who basically works at a lot of executive level discussions with companies and has a finger on the pulse for what's going on in the real world, not just the world of Microsoft, and then being able to have conversations with businesses and Microsoft around the way the market's going or things that Microsoft are planning to do, and they're looking for feedback to what they think that would have impact on businesses, and is it a good idea, what would we change? And so we're kind of used as this advocate or advisory external people that help them. There's about 150 of us in the world, and I represent the collaboration arena within the UK. So what does it mean in reality? Well, it just means that I'm used for feedback, but it also means that I can help customers that we're working with that have got blockers or pain points when they're trying to go into, say, Office 365, that they might have a particular blocker that's stopping them migrating to it, and I can potentially feed that back and help in terms of the Microsoft roadmap with that. In fact, a lot of the changes that happened to Microsoft Teams in the last sort of 12, 18 months, a lot of it was through heavy feedback sessions with the RDs when it first got released, in terms of why enterprises wouldn't uptake Teams until certain things had been put in place. That's the type of thing that we get involved in very early on. My email details on there. I'll share this again at the end of the session. And there's also a LinkedIn thing. So if you've never used that, just get on your mobile app, switch it over to contacts, and you should be able to find a contact link, and it should give you a little picture scanner. You just point it at that screen, and it will automatically hook up to LinkedIn to connect. But I'll share that again at the end of the session. What do we do in terms of Combined Knowledge? For those of you who are on the call who don't know us, we started out as an education company, primarily just doing classroom training, and I myself have been training Microsoft content since the late 90s. And we build now, in the last 15 or so years, 17 years that we've been growing, not just classroom and education programs, but whole adoption and onboarding skills programs that don't, literally start from end to end. So it could be IT all the way down to digital or end user programs. And it's actually only through the years of working with customers and building our own content that we've been able to get to this point as a business where we can now literally walk in and do an end-to-end project. And that took years and years to develop that program. And it's interesting actually, because the whole point of today's workshop is about an adoption program. How do you build that? How do you sustain it? And I thought I'd start with a bit of history lesson, right, around this whole subject, because, if we go back in time to pre-2007, pretty much all training was governed as a classroom model. So we would, for example, teach the IT guys, and predominantly IT, how to build servers, how to set up the applications so that they performed well, how to make sure that the upgrades could work, best practices to avoid, doing certain things that would stop certain upgrades and things like that. Not that many people have listened to that advice, but as anybody that worked with SharePoint on-prem would know. And it was always in person. Now, one of the things that things like SharePoint brought into the mix back in those days was, of course, it was the first application in Microsoft's stack that really changed the audience that you needed to bring on board in terms of being a success of the product. So you've got the server side for the IT, you have the service desk supporting that, but then you also have the users who were trying to figure out the best ways that they would use SharePoint for their collaboration and finding information. So post 2007, when SharePoint really started to pick up, and then up to 2010 when it started to really get mass usage, we started to do a lot more what we would call end user workshops, where you would build a end user focused training program and usually you would go on site for this, where you would deliver, say, a bunch of classes where all the users would come in, and it would bespoke training to exactly what they're going to expect in their SharePoint. By 2010 on to 2013, we started then blending that. So there was a mix between some online delivery. So we started building online training rooms. There was on-premise where you were doing custom. And there was a blend between all of it where you'd start teaching IT, service desk, power users, and then some end-user workshops as well. But the end-user workshops were generally still very underfunded. We generally found that a lot of the investment and the money went to IT and sort of the power user side. The users were given a very small budget in terms of how they were going to use it. And of course, that became one of the reasons why, around 2013 timeframe, we noticed that a lot of the SharePoint rollouts were failing because there was very little adoption on utilizing the product well. So it ultimately became a very expensive file share, intranet, whatever, because people just weren't using it properly. And the company hadn't thought about that enough. And the company hadn't said, what do we want out of it as a business? What do the users need out of it? And how do we create that? How do we join those dots and transition those users to it, who maybe were using file shares back in the day or some other tools in terms of collaboration? And that caused a real problem. And then ultimately, after 2013, when the focus started to really start going, well, actually, maybe we should start thinking about the user side. That's when we started to see things like on-demand videos coming out, where people would build various training videos, onboarding videos. Companies like ours and others started building videos as part of support and training and injecting it into the products. So suddenly we ended up by sort of 2015, 2016 timeframe, as a company, you could now actually get the whole stack. You could do classroom training for key people, custom workshops for the core users, service desk. You could do online blended learning depending on where they were, so you could do a global rollout very easily. And then you've got things like video on demand, which would help for the long sort of term duration, post-training, post-live, and that kind of approach for support continuously. And of course, this was all tying in with the move to online, because obviously from 2010 onwards, Microsoft were building BPOS, the online, which ultimately became Office 365 today, is in its incarnation today. And so there were lots of different places that the users and the business were now working, so different approaches were needed for the education. And then ultimately that became, in the last few years, where we started working a lot more specifically with companies, especially in Office 365, where we started looking at persona-based learning, because Office 365 can do so much. I mean, it's a huge stack of applications, and there are tooling and application services that now work in lots of different ways, like mobile and stuff like that. So you could be a frontline worker in, say, the construction industry, and the way that you're going to leverage and use the technology is very different to an office-based user who's working in, say, customer relations. And so the growth of Office 365 and the growth of different ways of consuming and using content led to that requirement to start tailoring the experience to a certain type of user, making sure they get that experience. And that's where the persona title comes from. So from an evolutions perspective, this is where we've got to. And we kind of approach it as this culture, train, educate, communicate as a process. So whenever I'm talking with a business around building an adoption program, and you should all think about this in terms of your business, if you haven't got these kind of core elements covered, then you're probably missing one piece of it, or two pieces of it. Think about the bits that you're not yet doing, because a lot of what I've just talked about is all still relevant, but you've got to obviously have a program in place to deal with it. So a culture change is probably one of the most important things that you're going to have to deal with. And I'm still dealing with companies today that are moving their users from things like a shared U drive or a personal drive, etc. And they're still going through that transition even today. And I say even today, it's going to go on for years. It's not something that's going to happen and finish and complete soon. And for a lot of users, that culture change of cloud or 365 or remote working or, hey, I can use my phone now to collaborate. This is alien to a lot of the user force. And going back to my previous piece around the evolution of training, most companies have not invested in their users an awful lot in the last 15, 20 years. And so therefore, the culture change isn't just an educational one. It's actually a perception of technology and IT. And I actually still think, and feel free to comment and share your thoughts on that, but I actually think there's still a huge issue in the business world today where users are not even generally IT savvy. I mean, some are, some aren't, and this is kind of grey area where there's quite a lot of users who just don't necessarily are up to speed with IT in general. And sometimes an education adoption program needs to deal with that as well as the other pieces of technology. So I've mentioned on this slide that 90% of your users cannot be trained. I've been saying this for a long time. When I say cannot be trained, I'm talking about classroom training. So, you know, there are certain key groups of users that you are going to put through the training program, and they need face-to-face because they're at a certain level that's how they get the retention and the knowledge and experience and hands-on to actually get that depth that they need. But most of your user base are just trying to do their job. So this is where the adoption framework comes into play, because you've got to build a framework that deals with how to onboard and continually onboard those users, educate them, have them using the technology. And that onboarding process has to be relevant to the way they're going to use it. So you can't just, usually you can't, you know, there's no way actually that you can create one way of doing that. It'll be different things for different people that will work. So even though 90% of the user base isn't going to go through formal training, you still have to think about training the core group beforehand, like your power users, champions, service desk, IT, even execs, PAs. They still need to have some core group of knowledge and education, because if they're not brought into the program at the exec level, you're not going to get the business to say, yes, we love it, this is great. So that needs to happen as well. So you've got to build your framework and your program that works for everybody. And know your strengths around this. You know, figure out within this program what your strengths are, what people you've got that can help with this, so that you can figure out exactly where you need help, where you haven't got this covered, where you might need to bring somebody in, or you might need to hire somebody that can help who's got experience in that area. And the other thing that I would say that's really important in today's world, against, say, SharePoint 2010 or back in the on-prem days from 10 years ago, the biggest thing that's changed from a cultural change of the business method of adoption is, if I was teaching a company how to do SharePoint 2013, for example, we would teach the IT guys the power user. Then we would build a custom onboarding program, get the users on board, do some digital content. That would all be deployed and they'd start using it. At that point, the company is off and running, and they're not going to be bringing in major changes to the platform at that point. And so for the next 3 to 4 years, it'll be minor changes, but from a user's perspective, their job is set. They know what they're doing. Maybe they'll be given more access to things based on knowledge, and then they can be given that those extra elements of training. But on the whole, it was pretty fixed for that period of time before they upgraded to the next version. But of course, as we all know with Office 365, it is a continuous update. I mean, in the last few weeks alone, 46 updates got rolled out for Office 365 into different applications. Not all of them are going to hit your users, but at the same time, it's a huge impact. And this means that companies have got to start thinking of adoption, an adoption program, not just based on the first 12 months or 6 months, but it's got to be based on how do we get users up to an initial point that gets them doing their job, and then how do we build a program that literally runs year on year on year to onboard, keep them knowledgeable, keep them skilled up, and then also leverage potentially new applications that you're rolling out as a company, because you've got past phase 1 and phase 2 might be bringing in and introducing a new technology. So you're almost going to have to go through an onboarding process again, but albeit on a much smaller scale. So the program that you put into place for this has to be scalable and repeatable with a framework that works based on your user base and your user force and locations, etc., so that in 18 months' time, you haven't got this whole problem, which used to happen after sort of 5 years, but now happens a lot quicker, where you've suddenly got a whole de-skilled workforce that are now struggling to find anything useful, something. Microsoft has changed a feature, updated it, or changed it to such a degree that 60% of what the user used to know has disappeared or changed. So it really does bring a new element to adopting that sustainable side. And I almost call it education as a service, right? You almost need to introduce this service-driven onboarding and education skills process. So your company needs to think about a budget from a cost perspective of what that would look like on a yearly basis. I guess the plus side, though, is that you don't necessarily end up now spending all your money up front, because you can piecemeal it, bring people up to certain levels. You can use things like on-demand digital learning content to help with that, but then also shift some of that budget to a yearly element and then spread that across the user workforce to help them keep on top. So when I talk about sustainable adoption, and when I talk to businesses about how to plan for that and build that framework, it is a combination of all the things that I've just talked about that make it work. It's a really key part, and it's not just to the technical team, it's to the business and the user teams as well. It's to everybody. It's across the business that this has to be applied, this logic. Because as we all know from our classic marketing statements, adoption is dead easy. You just have to follow these few steps, and it's all intuitive. Users will just carry on using it, and it will not be an issue. One thing we know for sure in Office 365, with a lot of companies that did this leap early on and that did not treat this as a proper long-term framework approach, within 6 to 8 months, nobody was using it. The tools were redundant. Ghost town was roaming in 365. And we've had some companies who have been introduced to us who are literally saying, we've decided we're going back on-prem because it's just, we're spending all this money and nobody's using it. We could have done that on-prem. So it can be saved, those situations. It is possible to turn it around. But if you don't, the sooner you deal with these things in your planning, the more chance you've got of avoiding the tumbleweed problem of using all the tools that you want to release to the users. So one of the key things that I always talk about when I sort of focus on those pieces we just looked at before, all those different elements of the adoption program, make sure you understand where your current user base is. So, you can't just focus on one area of investment and think, well, that's going to work. So you can't just turn around and say, oh, we're just going to train IT. Oh, we're just going to train champions. Oh, we're just going to buy some video content. You can't focus on one or the other. What you've got to do first is actually build a maturity matrix where you've actually got all your different user groups, your different elements of your adoption plan, and then align that to what your current skills are in those different matrices, because that way you can kind of go, yeah, they're on board, they're fully au fait with doing this, that's not a problem. So a great example of that might be comms, the comms team. Have they built a comms program before on making people aware of technical issues or technical knowledge or what's new or what's coming, or, how do we deal with onboarding or bringing a new department onto 365 and engaging that and getting people excited? If they've never done that type of a technical comms process before, then they would need to. The reason I think about maturity model as part of your plan is because it helps you to define where you might need help. That's really what this boils down to. Because a lot of companies and a lot of planning people, project managers, the change managers, whatever they are, sometimes they look at a very siloed approach to this. They're looking at very specific areas, but in reality, we need to look at it from a much bigger sort of top-down perspective early on to identify where those gaps sit. So what you can see here on this table is a cost per user for the different types of deliveries that you may be thinking of. So if you're doing a classroom or a public class, you're just going to put somebody on it. then the cost associated with that is usually about £2,000 a person attending a sort of technical class, whatever. Some will be less, some will be more, depends. But on average, that's what you'll be paying. But of course, as I said earlier, less than 5% of your workforce is going to be doing this. So it's going to be a very early adopters, key people that are making IT decisions and design decisions are going to need that skills program on the new technology because they don't know it. And so that tends to be a small group of people that's invested in. Sometimes it might be more cost effective if you've got enough people for a particular skill set to bring on site and have your own classroom private to your company. Now that becomes more cost effective the more people you have to do this with, but it roughly works out around £850, £900 a person. And you could put, say, for example, 10, 12 people on that class, focus it on what you want. So it could be like a service desk training or, sort of a power user dedicated to your knowledge requirement. That's great. Again, you'd probably be less than 10% of the workforce that would be leveraging that cost. You might then do an onboarding process. And an onboarding process might be where you're running a bunch of workshops in preparation for a rollout of, say, OneDrive or Teams or SharePoint or a mixture of these. Could be anything from 1 hour to 2 hour to 3 hour deliveries for a group of people. And you can run these quite large audiences. I mean, last couple of months alone, I mean, we did 1 week where I think we trained something like 98 people a day or something on average for a customer. So we went, I think over the space of 2 months, we went to different companies. In total, we delivered end user sort of custom delivery onboarding to somewhere in the region of 900 users over 2 months. So the scale becomes achievable with small onboarding workshops because you can do it to a larger audience as well, and it's focused on getting them to do their job. When do I use what? How do I use it? What's relevant to me? So very focused. And you can do a much larger user-based rollout for that. For smaller companies, medium companies, you can actually achieve probably a 90% user base on that. For larger companies, you tend to hit a certain group of people. And then you might, for example, record these deliveries so that you can make others learn it or have your champions regurgitate it, kind of push it to the user base, engage them more locally. Because obviously if you've got, say, 20,000 people, running custom workshops for every single person is impossible. It's never going to work to that scale. But then what you can do to scale, as well as having things like champions and local education people pushing it then down, you could then support that with things like digital training, support tooling that's all on demand, grab it when you need it, and have people focused and push that content at them using things like learning management systems, whatever. And that's how you can then get 100% effective learning. So in my experience, that's kind of rough areas, but in my experience and what we've done over the last 15, 17 odd years, those are numbers that are pretty accurate from that sense. The other thing that, let me just get this back onto, I'm now afraid I didn't realise there was a timer thing on this. Maybe that's to keep me going, I don't know. So basically what you need to do is just to summarise that sort of the last few minutes, I'll say a few minutes, make sure you've got a clear pathway of that. So make sure you're driving that process, that vision down to training with the champions, the engagement, the different areas of that. Make sure you've built a clear pathway as part of your design. It's very important that you actually have this structured. I mentioned the personas. Really important that you actually map this out as well. When you build, and this is a persona model that we used for a customer of ours, and each of the different personas mapped to the way people work. So it wasn't based on I'm a HR person, it was based on what their jobs are, what they've got to do and how they've got to do it. And depending on whether they were a user or a champion or a community lead person or just an end user consuming, determined how long they needed specific training, what that training looked like, and how they would consume it, and what applications were included in that particular task. Now, in this particular example here, these personas had a lot of on-demand videos. There were also some bite-sized focus workshops, depending on what they were consuming. But make sure that when you're building your adoption program, make sure that you are building these personas. And a lot of people struggle with this because they don't yet know what that would look like, but you need to start doing some work on it. If you're not sure how to build that, ping me offline, and I'll always give you kind of some guidance and advice on how you can start with this. But it's important to build it. Because now that you've got the persona, you've got the vision, you kind of know where you want to get to as a business, you've got that sort of design in your head, you can then start building a proper learning plan around all of these elements. So you can put a time frame against the different types of groups of people, what they need to know when, and then align that to the rollout of the 365 applications, onboarding different groups of people. So for example, you've got your pilot and your project team, which are going to do the early training, might be classroom, mixture of workshops and classroom. And then you start bringing on your champions, getting those skilled up and ready to go to the live workforce, make sure they've got necessary skills and content that they're going to follow up on and reference later on. And then after the whole go live scenario, when you've done your initial onboarding and your initial readiness, then you need to think about that long tail after you've gone live as to how all the users are going to continue to get engaged with and have go-to people or content after the go live date. Because a lot of companies miss this bit. They spend all this money on sort of skilling up a certain group of people, or all this money investing in, say, champions, but they forget that actually post live, not every user is going to consume content or have skills learning in the same way. And it's a very common issue that we have when we see a company that's invested heavily in one area but missed two of the other areas that actually for their use would have a real impact. And a great example of that would be you might be working in an industry where 60% of the users are remote. Well, a champion isn't really going to help them because they're not local to the users. The users now need quick, easy ways to get information on maybe FAQs, the ability to ask questions, the ability to get support, and maybe have very specific learning programs for things like how do I do my job from my house or from this app or from here? How do I do my job? What are the things I need to know to do that job? I don't need to know all this other stuff. And you can use tools like Yammer, for example, as a really good corporate communication to do like FAQs. In fact, Yammer just brought out a Q&A feature that you can use for exactly this type of thing for remote people to be able to track and see Q&As and different support for certain functional roles, not just I'm a user. I noticed there was a question there, Tom. Is it something I need to know? No? Oh. I've got a few questions. Oh, no, so it's just a question. So Alistair was asking, are we going to be able to get a recording of this? Yes, Alistair, that's the answer. Yep, you will. So I mentioned comms a while ago when I said, make sure the comms team are on board. One of the things that's really important in an adoption process is bringing the people along with you, both well in advance, during the onboarding, during the adoption program, and after. And that can be things like branding posters and various things around the workforce. You could get, I remember we did a project with Johnson Matthey, and these guys did like mugs, and they had like little paraphernalia in the offices that popped up, and when they were onboarding different locations, they would have like a cake ceremony, and everybody would take a picture with everybody there, and they'd post it onto their Yammer chat, and it became a very social engagement. But what was interesting about it, and what you'll notice is interesting about what you see on the screen, which is various sort of branding we've done for various customers in the past, you'll notice that none of them mention SharePoint or Teams or any particular product. It's a brand of the business moving forward with digital technology. We are changing the way we work. We want to work better. We want to be more communicative. community-based and more collaborative-based, and we want to be able to support you as a user being able to do your job. This is the sort of communication that's important. So you really don't want to be focusing on let's use SharePoint today. We've seen customers that have tried this. It does not work. So think of branding what you're trying to do as a business rather than the technology itself. And think of the user first. In fact, if any of you follow standard change management, ProSci, all this kind of stuff where people are talking about change management and adoption, basically that whole ProSci process is about putting the user first, and then how do you engage the business and the user to ultimately come up with this type of approach to your adoption. Not just basically say, oh, IT wants to deploy this. No, it's about what do we need as a business, align that to the user requirements, put the user needs first, build a brand around it, push it out and use the technology to deliver it. If you go down this route, it's easier to get that message across. And some things can really help the user. So, I was talking the other day to a customer about supporting some frontline workers again, and they said that these users don't even have a PC. They share a PC. They're not even IT savvy. They just go up, they do their job, whatever it might be, and there's this shared PC, whatever. Well, in that situation, believe it or not, you could actually, and we've done this before, you could take like a guide on how to do stuff, could be 3 or 4 sheets, you laminate it, you stick it right there next or on the wall next to that PC. Suddenly, the users don't have to think, don't need support, they're not making phone calls to anybody, they just literally look at that and they go, oh yeah, all right, do that, right, bang. For them, that's a win. That's more than they've ever had because nobody's ever thought of that before. So there are more ways to skin a cat, right? I've never understood where that phrase comes from. It's a very scary phrase, actually, isn't it? Who would skin a cat? I was thinking about it. I said, no, I must get off. That was just, my thought process is diverting now. Now, something else to think about when you're driving that engagement, it's not just about sort of posters and awareness, but it's also about making sure that the users feel that they're engaged with this. One way you can do that, you'll notice on here, we did an engagement with SSE where we actually created a bunch of interviews with the CEO, the chief executive of the whole of the utilities company. And we basically said, so what is your vision? Well, we want to do this. We're going to spend all this money, but this is what we want to achieve. We want a completely digital transformation against our users, everything else. We want to really make this work. So the first thing we said was, well, if you're on board with this, Mr. Chief Exec, why don't you tell everybody? Why don't we share that? Why don't you become part of the process? And so we did. So we made all these videos. This is what we want to do. And we pushed that out as a communicative platform that everybody could watch and then drive that engagement down from the top as well as from the bottom in terms of what the users want. So it became a top-down, bottom-up approach. Then squarely in the middle was things like IT, service desk, power users, champions that made sure that what they were saying they could relate to and drive, and these users could then be brought along on the journey. Everything worked together. And that would include things like various tip sheets and tricks and tips and all various communique that went out on the back of that. Now, one of the key, and it's a very cliche word at the minute, is everything talks about champions, but in reality, champions have come under the guise of many names in the last 15 years of collaboration. But basically, we're just talking about a group of people who are there to be close to the user base. So these aren't service desk or IT. These are people who are much closer to the various users. They're supporting the users at say a departmental level or a floor level or a location level. They are there to help users to use the technology properly, when to use what questions, that type of thing, and make sure that the adoption program is actually continuing. So you might find champions living on Yammer, doing conversations, asking questions, posting a new feature, and then maybe a quick step on how to use it. They're influencing other people to use that and say, hey, did you know you could do this? So they're really evangelizing the product and supporting the local users before that even becomes an elevated support. One of the things that I would say to all of you to think about with these people, whatever you're going to call them, but think of a brand for them, give them something. For some users, the companies go out there and they try to say, you'll be a champion. Well, that's not going to work, because the first thing they're going to say is, well, what do I get for doing that? So you might turn around and say, we're going to take some of this work off you so that you can have an hour a day to help with this. So that might be one option. Or you might choose to give them a little bit more recognition. We can do badges for them. So for example, we created a badge recently that you could just attach to your profile. So it was just a champion's badge, pop it on the profile, took the user 30 seconds to do it, and that became their profile sort of relevance in the business, and it became a nice thing. Promote them through comms, make sure people know they exist, and put a name to a face, right? That's very important. We find that's a really good way of influencing others. The people feel closer to these than they would, say, the IT team. So some key considerations to think about from the user perspective. Make sure the workshops, if you're going to start bringing the users up to speed, they would be very focused, small workshops. When to use what, awareness of what they're getting. The champion's going to have a little bit more, right? The champions might be a one-day, training for them based on what they need to know for the user support, whereas the users just need literally 1 to 2 hour small bite-sized workshops focusing on what they need to know. Try and do too much, you'll lose them. Try and do too little, and they still go away confused. Think about integrating quick wins into these workshops, where you might say, did you know you can do a meeting in Teams straight from Outlook? Oh, I didn't know you could do that. Right? Just that one thing, a user goes, that's brilliant. Quite often, I find that people that are project managing and doing adoption programs completely miss the fact that for most users, the simplest wins are the ones that actually get them engaged and excited. People often think, oh, look, we can do all this stuff in Teams. It might not be that excites a user at all. It might just be the fact that they can create a meeting in Teams and then have it linked through a plan and use Planner to link it. And they're like, brilliant, that's it, sold. And so find what those little quick wins are for your users. For others, it might be mobile apps, and they didn't realize that they could install the mobile app. In fact, I was at a company, we were talking about the adoption program, and I said, is there a restriction on users putting apps on their phones? And they went, no. And I said, so why is it not part of your program? And they hadn't thought of that. They were like, well, yeah. The assumption that users would know what to do with phones, I don't know, or just they forgot that actually that would be a real benefit for a certain group of users. So easy to forget these little things. In person or online or on demand videos, it all works. But if you're doing workshops and it's in person or online like this is, always record it and make sure you then put it into Stream, for example. If you're using Teams, it'll automatically go into Stream. And then you can promote that video through Yammer and other comms that it now exists. Why is this important? Because you might be onboarding somebody next month or the month after. They need to see that for the first time because maybe you're not running an in-person or an online event at that time. And it helps as a nice follow-on reference for the users that were on it, that said they were okay, but in reality they're kind of going, I really didn't understand some of that. Well, also think about, from users, measuring those skills that they're doing. So, maybe having some kind of learning program, Q&A sessions, use a learning management system if you've got it to reinforce that learning. If you want to do skills measurement, very important part of the user measurement. And again, I say it again, don't forget, features and 365 is evergreen. It will keep changing. You have to have a process and consideration in your program for that reskilling and updating people on those features as they change. That's where things like your champions can come in, digital training content on demand, and other tooling that can help that process of continuous skilling and learning as things happen. So the way we deal with that in CK is we built a tool called Training Plus, which is basically we took our trainers who write the content and deliver courseware and so teach the users in those workshops. And then we took all of that and digitized it in a green screen room and made it so that it was interactive in person. So if you're thinking about building videos and this type of thing, one of the things we found that make it a lot more engaging for users is actually, we have the trainer as part of the video, and it's actually not just about a video with a voiceover. Users don't engage with that. We found that actually having somebody there with the users makes a big difference to the amount of information they actually are interested in learning. And then they're more intrigued to go back and look at other courses on the back of that, because they soon realize it's more like a learning model rather than just watching a flat video. We do also have a support product, which is actually the videos, which is more about 30-second how do I, but it's not just about the how sometimes, it's about the why. So when you're thinking about a user engagement program, think about that long-term sort of why I'm doing this and why would I want to learn that and how do I use it to the best, best of my, oh, I didn't realize I could do it that. Oh, I didn't realize you could do that, right? That's the sort of thing you're trying to solve. Oh, this is on the slides later. So one of the other things, and I've specifically put this here to remind me actually to talk about something. One of the things to think about with consuming what I would call on-demand content, so ways that users are going to consume and get access to various pieces of content that's not actually in person or a champion or whatever. One of the things that we learned over the last few years when we've been working in these different areas of sort of that tail-end engagement is how do you keep users having the ability to get access to content in the relevant place at the point that they need it, but where the content is actually relevant to their job, their task, whatever. So one of the things that we started to do was started working on the ability to take content from a core system and then link it to different places. So you might, for example, be in SharePoint. So if I'm in a SharePoint site and I want to get help in that content in SharePoint, but more specifically on how to use that process or that feature, then I want to be able to inject my help and support into that site specifically for those 6 tasks that they've got to do, those 6 videos they need to have. So rather than have 400 videos all in one big place that they've got to navigate through, focus videos in exactly what they need at the place they're at. So we started working on linking, sort of embedding links into Teams, SharePoint, into the app launcher, anywhere they need to do it. That became a very effective way of sort of push support, but only relevant to where they need it. And then became another really important part of the ongoing skills. And this kind of ties into a little bit of make sure my users are up to a certain skill level before they can get something, but also that continuous learning. And that was the ability to leverage learning management systems for that skills program. So it might be a case of saying, before you can go into Microsoft Teams, we need to make sure you follow these 6 things on Teams learning. And then once you've got that, then we'll process you into the Teams and then you can get it, etc. But then what happens when Teams has changed 60% or 40% over the next 12 months? Your learning management system can then obviously alert the user that they need to reskill or push more training back at them. You can then reinforce that training through things like quick Q&A, questions, quizzes, that kind of thing, which reinforces their learning at that point. So it's really important that you consider the different ways in which users can consume help and support and training content as that long tail. And this is how you get that 90% of the users engaged, not that 10% that we talked about. This is your 90% success rate. And then you've got to measure it. So this slide comes from the Microsoft Adoption Pack. So this is free. You can go to the Microsoft Adoption, search for it in your favorite search engine, look for 365 Adoption Pack. It's a Power BI dashboard. It's all free. And what it does is it gives you statistics on all of the different tools, collaboration, OneDrive, SharePoint, email, etc. And it gives you statistics about users who are using certain tools in certain ways. So as part of your adoption program, you might be saying, we want to reduce emails in favor of OneDrive for this feature, and then we want to use SharePoint for that, and we want to use Teams for that. So as part of that adoption, as you go through those different education processes, and as you start deploying the different help and support and champions programs and all the rest of it, as you start doing all of that, you should start to see these impact going into the different applications. This adoption pack from Microsoft will show you that. It'll show you that's going down, that's going up, SharePoint's doing this, OneDrive, we've got people doing that. It's actually a perfect measurement tool of adoption is actually happening in your business. Quite often people say to me, but we want to know who watched that video. We want to know who clicked. Did they watch all of it? Okay, if you were doing a skills program and you wanted to assess somebody who had actually followed a process before you give them access, then that is a skills measurement, and that's what learning management is for. That's what a learning management system does, and it does it very well. And there's lots of learning management systems out there that you can leverage to do that. When we look at our content, we don't care what learning management system you've got. We just inject it, and it works in any of them. But measurement is a key part of that. A question was just asked, well, what about different content that's out there, like the Microsoft Learning Pathways or this other content? The answer is it all helps. There's some free content on Microsoft that you can use. There's not lots of it, and that's my timer, by the way. That's to make sure I go, 10 minutes to go. So the Microsoft has some free videos, and you can access those on their support channels. The Learning Pathway is basically Microsoft's vision of leveraging their content that's already exists and with a few new videos. But it's okay, but it's limited. It's not all up to date, so it's a mixed bag. And it might not be worded in a way that is relevant to your users. So I always think that the best answer is go and look at what's out there, decide what's useful. If it is useful, great, and then figure out the bits where you've got the gaps, and then decide where you're going to do that, whether you're going to produce it yourself, create your own, buy in, or work with a company that can customize. That's really a choice when it comes to the video content. My biggest thing that I will say to anybody with video content, and I only can say this because we do it, so we have about 160, 70 hours odd for Office 365 training across the apps. We probably update 60% of that every year. If I was to start from scratch and do it all again and do all of that content with my delivery people to create it, it would take about 400 days from scratch. So if you think you're going to have people do this internally, be prepared for this to be full-time jobs. That's all I'm saying. If you're prepared to do that, great. But that's one of the problems because the features are always changing. And it could be the slightest change that means you need to do an update. And it can cost a huge amount of hours of production time because your users are obviously going to want that update when they next do the training. So it's very important that you keep that side to it. But yes, see what's out there. Don't be afraid to go out and test the different vendors, the different freebies that are out there, and see how good it is. You may well find it helps to a degree, but you may well find that it's not thorough enough to support what you need. But when done right, if you think about all the things that I've just talked about in the last 50 odd minutes, when it's done right, you should be able to measure the success in many different ways. Productivity goes up. Users are being able to work better, easier. It's not based on, are you doing that job? It's now a case of I can do my job and I can do it in the way I need to do it from where I need to do it. That flexibility comes in. On the back side of that, there might be more business automation. You're leveraging things like some of the Power Apps and Flow, AI, some of these capabilities in cloud that have opened up so many doors to automation that, again, takes some of that sort of wearing a user down experience and now automates it for them, which brings in less blockers. So now we can turn around and say, hey, yeah, you get this automated alert, and now you'll be on your phone. You can just open it, select the answer, press go, and off it goes and triggers, a whole other piece of collaboration. So the tools are there, and the tools are growing. I will just say one thing, though. Some of the tools are brilliant. Just remember that they do have a license cost for it. So sometimes such as like Power Apps, for example, there was a change to the licensing. Some things might look very cool, but they might come at a cost. So don't always think that Office 365 is ultimately going to be cheaper. It might not be cheaper, but it might give you that productivity increase, the automation, less blockers, which means proactive users, which means adoption, culture change, success around all of that. What cost is that? If it's not costing you much more than it did before for on-prem, I would call that a huge success and a huge win in terms of why you've done it. So a real key part of the adoption process that when it's done right, you should be experiencing that. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm conscious of the fact that we are at 5 to, and I wanted to give people the opportunity to ask a few questions as well for the last few minutes that I could share out. I will make sure that we find a way to get this information out to you guys and share it with you. Somebody's asked the question, can you recommend tools for producing or editing video tutorials? I mean, there's the obvious tools out there like Camtasia and stuff like that, which are okay. So yeah, I would say personally speaking, things like that, if you want to have just a quick video, Camtasia can work. If you're doing something like a broadcast to your user base, Microsoft Teams is brilliant. You can use Teams as a broadcaster internally, do like a webinar, and then just as you finish it, it'll record it, post it in stream. So that could be quite useful for your sort of help desk type people to use. I suppose I should go back in time a little bit, and before I started that, I suppose the question could also say, how do we do it? The bottom line is we actually use a combination of tools here when we build our videos. We've got Adobe Premiere, we've got some Camtasia stuff, we've got our own green screen production room with 4K cameras recording stuff, and then we have a post-production where people are lacing it all together to produce the final video. And so, if you were looking at us doing it, for a 2-hour video for us could take, a couple of days to actually build end to end from the trainer and everything. So it depends what quality you want at the end of it and how you're trying to manage that. But yeah, Camtasia is pretty good for that. So yeah, that's what we recommend. Any other questions? So we've got a few minutes still to go, a couple of minutes. Anybody got another question they'd like to ask? I'm just thinking, Tom, we'll post this recording, guys, so we'll put it on the YouTube channel or something, won't we? Yeah, we'll put it on a YouTube channel. So if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so. What's the best way to measure success if you don't have a learning management system? Great question. So learning management systems are great for measuring the fact that a user's gone through a program. So if you think about digital skills, you might be onboarding a bunch of people in different areas, and you want to make sure that they've successfully done the Teams training, for example, or the SharePoint training, because they came from SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint online. And so you want to make sure that they have a structured learning plan. So a learning management system is great for that because it builds the learning plan. They have to follow the sections. They get completion, certificate, badge, whatever. So the learning management system is great for that. But if what you're trying to do is measure adoption, i.e. are my users being onboarded and starting to use the technology in the way that they want to, i.e. using SharePoint as an app or or remote or whatever, that is actually more about proving that users are using the technology. So that free adoption pack from Microsoft is a really good way of doing that because it's free to deploy and it will show you those users after they've been onboarded and told how to use the tools, when to use what. You should start to see that measurement going up in terms of tooling changing. They change their pattern. You see that pattern change. That's how I would measure that adoption at that point. That's where your success is because it proves people are using the tools. The other thing that I would say is an important part of adoption proving is, let's say you're going to start moving to something like Yammer as a corporate communication. Are people going there to then start looking at Q&A, watching the videos? Are people actually engaging? If they're not engaging, then you're missing a piece of getting that engagement with the user base. That's something you might need to work at. Is there a similar adoption tool for on-prem? as in the Microsoft adoption pack. No, well, could you build something like that? Yeah, potentially, because you could use SQL. There is a Power BI equivalent on-prem that can generate those dashboards. The problem is, where do you grab those statistics from? Therein lies the problem. See, Microsoft is able to surface up all of these different tooling and statistics because of the APIs that use the graph that capture it all. And so that's how Microsoft are able to bring that in. So does that capability exist on-prem out the box? No. You'd have to look at building your own bespoke reports, dashboards. It'd be a lot of work. There are ways to grab some of this data through audit logs, client launching, stuff like that, but it would be very difficult to do on-prem in the same easy way, I'd say. Adding badges to profile. Oh, somebody said, so mentioned adding a badge to profile. Where in the user's profile do you upload them to? So for example, if you're in Teams, you can edit your profile from there and just add the badge into the picture there. So they edit their picture in their profile. So it's the profile picture behind their actual user profile that does that. So, but they have to do it, right? So we tend to give them the graphic and then they edit their profile and then they just attach the badge to it. So we can send you that. And I know we're going to talk soon anyway, so I'll make sure we can share that with you on how to do that. It's a very quick and easy thing. Takes a user about 30 seconds. But yes, little things like that make a big difference. Don't underestimate the benefit and the power of little wins. You know, sometimes businesses think it's all about the big picture. More often than not, it's about the little wins that get a user on board. You've got to identify what those little wins are. And that's the key to being able to drive this. I noticed we're out of time. Hopefully, no more questions. Thank you, everybody, for joining. It's been a pleasure. I will, actually, before we shoot off, I'll leave this on the screen for a little bit, which is how to connect with me if any of you want to. That's my LinkedIn profile on there. And I shall just leave that on. Thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate you. I hope you find it useful. And there was a few nuggets. That's always the key for these things for me, is hopefully there's a few nuggets. And if there's anything we can help you with or anything I can help you with, please do contact me. My contact details are on there. And failing that, have the rest of the week. Hope it goes well. And hopefully speak to you all again soon. Cheers, everybody. Goodbye.